All that in the next hour. And with us for the whole of the programme today is Miatta Fahnbulleh, who's Chief Executive of the New Economics Foundation. Welcome.
Thank you.
First of all today, Labour is promising to get tough on employers who don't close their gender pay gap. The party says if they get into power, all companies with over 250 employees will face an audit on salaries. And if they can't show they're taking action to close the gap, they may be fined. Do you support this, Miatta?
Yeah, I mean, so if you put it in context, there's clearly a problem with the gender pay gap. Yes, we've seen progress, but my gosh, it's been incredibly painfully slow. And at the current rate at which we're improving things, women won't have pay parity with men until the 2050s. So we absolutely need to act. There are lots of complicated issues that sit underneath it, but the very minimum we should expect is that actually companies ought to audit this and that they should be transparent about it. And I think you probably do need to go further. So I think there's something in Labour's plan that you set an expectation that you not just find out what your pay gap is, but you actually take action to solve it, because that's the thing that changes company behaviours.
And do you think fines will persuade companies to change their behaviour?
Well, it depends on how you do the fine. It depends on the level of the fine. But we know that we've seen in other forms of regulation that when there is a penalty to not acting, it starts to shift behaviour. But it has to be part of a much, much wider package of things.
Because you yourself said it's complicated. The reasons behind it are complicated, and companies will no doubt argue that some of it is historical and legacy. I mean, would you suggest, if you want to see a much faster pace of change, as you say, it's taking a very, very long time, do you insist that men's salaries come down or that women's pay goes up?
Well, so I would argue for women's pay to go up, but there are lots of issues. So part of the problem is that we don't see enough women in the top jobs, and actually getting more equality around top executive jobs is something that companies can kind of push in their recruitment and their progression policies. Part of it is the fact that actually, we still have the case where women are doing the same job as men but not being paid the same amount, which is illegal.
Isn't that breaking the law?
It is absolutely illegal.
So how is it that companies are being able to get away with it?
Because you can always justify it by certain reasons, and some of it is legacy, some of it is endemic. But, actually putting a spotlight on the issue and requiring companies to then act, I think, is part of that. And then some of it is to do with kind of family-friendly policies and the fact that actually still in our workplaces, women who have children are penalised. So, yes, there are a whole package of issues, but at the start, you've got to recognise that there's a problem and you've got to be willing to take action. And that's what these sorts of policies might do.
All right. Would you suggest, looking at this from the outside, that is really going to do anything to exert pressure on the Russian state?
Well, I think we've got to establish the facts first. And then if there is a link, the question is what you do. I think the room for manoeuvre is actually quite limited for the UK government acting unilaterally. I think there is something about property, because actually Russian money coming into our property market has been massively distorting. So it not only will benefit us in terms of foreign policy, but I think actually will benefit the property market domestically. But I think the big thing is, will it have any impact? And I fear it won't, because in the end, only multilateral action across the EU, ironically, would put us in a position where we could actually bite, and so the Russian government might change its behaviour. But I worry that Britain just acting on its own, even if it is a combination and package of things, in the end won't fundamentally change the behaviour of the Russian state.
Thank you both very much. I have to finish it there. Now, it seems where you live can have a dramatic influence on your life expectancy. Latest figures.
And those have all been the priorities of the government.
Right, Miatta, do you agree? I mean, is income and having a job clearly important in terms of being in work and earning money? But what do you take away from these figures on life expectancy?
So the figures are staggering. The fact that they're going backward, I think, is incredibly worrying. And I think
in certain areas, not all areas.
In certain areas, but I think it's indicative of a bigger problem, which is that, for many people, the economy isn't just working. We've had a decade of wage stagnation and more to come. For many people, they've seen a squeeze in their living standards. We're seeing huge inequality across the country, where actually a lot of the recovery we've seen since the financial crisis has been in London and the South East, and other parts of the countries haven't benefited. So there are deep structural problems, And and the figures that you're seeing on life expectancy, healthy life expectancy, are indication of the fact that for big chunks of our population, they are just struggling, and they're struggling to get on, and they're struggling to feed their kids, and it's filtering through into these figures.
Right.
I mean, the difficulty is you can reel off the stats, but that's not what people are feeling. And people are struggling. They are feeling worse off. You see it up and down the country. And I think the question about devolution is quite an interesting one, because the capacity of our local government, our community groups to actually try and solve some of these problems, I think is massively constrained. And that's one of the areas where actually we can take action to give them the power and resources to try and act now.
Right.
But the truth is people are struggling and they're not feeling the benefits that you're talking in the headline stats. So that is not their experience.
What would you do? Would an increase in wages make a big difference?
An increase in wages is an important part of that, but to do that, you've got to think about how we boost wages, for example, in our low-wage, low-skilled parts of the economy. That's about a proper active industrial strategy, but that's also about the power balance in the labour market. So ensuring that actually workers have more power so they can have more secure jobs, but that they can actually argue that more of the benefits of the work that they do go to them as wages rather than to shareholders.
I'm sorry that we have to end it there. Chris, thank you for coming. Who's right in terms of the political parties on whether we should be in a customs union or not?
So it's complicated. I don't know about who's right, but for me, I think you've got to go back to why many people voted to leave the European Union, which was essentially because they were frustrated with the state of the economy. They were frustrated and fed up with their living standards being squeezed. Things like the housing crisis, worried about the prospect for their children. So I think when you come to these, and they are very techie, complex issues, like the customs union, your test has to be, will it make it easier or will it make it harder to address some of these issues? Will it make it easier to create jobs? Will it make it easier to deal with living standards? And if it doesn't, then why would you do it? So if you take something like the customs union for me, the idea that we should be part of a customs union with our biggest trading bloc feels like a no-brainer if your test is jobs, living standards and making life better for people.
Would that be worth it? And is that guaranteed?
Well, exactly. It's not guaranteed. So it is a hope. It's a bit of speculation. It's a hope. In the end, it's about the trade-offs. So, yes, you might or you might not get marginally lower food prices, but you will still have a negative knock-on effect on other parts of the economy. And if you go back to the point, you made the point that actually people voted for a range of reasons. That is absolutely right. But there was a chunk of people that voted for the reasons that I've talked about. And no one voted to leave the European Union in order to be worse off. No one, irrespective of what their motivation is. So when you look at the trade-offs against things like the impact on our businesses, the impact on jobs, you have to ask yourself whether it's worth it.
Would you object to a law like this, Miatta?
Well, so it's clearly bad behaviour, and I disagree insofar as, it's sexist and it shouldn't be tolerated. And there's a spectrum, and I think you do have to be proportionate. And, some of the things that we see, men taking pictures of women up their skirt and stuff, absolutely should be banned. Catcalling, wolf whistling, I think we do need, within the bounds of the existing law actually, to treat them firmly and more strongly than we are at the moment. But I think there's a kind of cultural norm. I think if you say it's okay, people will continue doing it. But actually, if more people are saying this is absolutely disgraceful, it is unacceptable, you cannot behave in that way, that in itself starts to shift the cultural norm.